go. Hello everyone and welcome to this critical conversation, which is the first of this academic year. We're really delighted to have you joining us, whether you are live with us this evening or whether you are catching up on YouTube. It's great to have you, and it's great to be back on Teams for critical conversations. We've missed it over the summer. So tonight, the panel is a very interesting one, and the issue that we're discussing is the issue of whose museums. Now, this is directly linked to our current temporary exhibition that's on in the Wardlaw Museum until the 22nd of October 2022, which is called Recollecting Empire. And this exhibition really explores the fact that empire is not just a thing of the past. Its legacies are all around us, and there are multiple perspectives that need to be considered when looking at empire. And Recollecting Empire is an exhibition that really tries to tackle those legacies head on and explores colonialism from a variety of perspectives and foregrounds voices that have been excluded, showcases creative responses, and considers how museums and society can move forward for a more equitable future. So the exhibition is part of a wider project at the Museums of the University of St Andrews, to explore how we tackle the legacies of empire in our collections, and event series like critical conversations and other work that we're doing all contributes towards this. So before we get launched into our discussion, it's worth me saying that we have the Q&A function enabled this evening, so feel free to ask our panelists questions throughout the event. I'll pick them up and send them in their direction, and if anybody needs captioning, if you press the three dots and select closed captioning, you can follow along with the captioning there. So I thought what would be a good idea to begin with is to introduce our panelists for the evening, and I am going to let them do the introductions themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves and their work and their areas of interest that have maybe led them to be sitting on this panel this evening. So first on my screen, and therefore first in the firing line, is Akira. Akira, do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Of course not. No, hello everyone. My name's Akira O'Connor. I'm a member of academic staff in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience, and I am also the university's Race Equality Charter Chair. The aspect of me being a member of staff in psych and neuroscience it is one of the things actually that has a lot of relevance for my interest in this. I'm very interested in the stories that shape the discipline that exists now of psychology. I've been doing a bit of research into that and therefore kind of critically interested in some of these broader discussions that we're having. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much, Akira. And next on my screen is Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm a third-year art history and film studies student. I'm also the current president of the Student Archaeology Society. I'm always very interested in material culture, and because I'm doing material culture on film, and coming from Hong Kong, a place of having a colonial past, it feels kind of personal, and really want to do like a research or to get to know more about the effects of colonialism and how it affects like culture and the fabric of society in a way.
That's great. Thank you, Dawn. And last but not least, Thomas.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Bender. I'm a fourth year studying ancient history and archaeology. I'm the vice president of the Students Archaeology Society, and I'm also the president of the School of Classics. And one of the reasons why I'm sitting here is sort of my background in cultural heritage and research. For the past 2.5 years, I've worked at the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, working on research related to cultural heritage preservation and also projects related to it also. So my interest is mostly in sort of how we understand heritage right now and how that has changed over time. Of course, ancient history to cultural heritage in contemporary studies is a sort of a large, sort of leap. But they marry rather well in sort of understanding how people deal with their heritage and how we can, sort of form museums and form efforts right now.
Thank you so much, everybody. So as everybody who's tuning in to this conversation will be well aware, we have people from a variety of perspectives here this evening, which is super exciting. I thought what might be an interesting way to start this conversation is to just open with a very broad question, which is the theme of the conversation. And that is, whose museum? I think it would be quite interesting to know what immediately sprung to mind for you all when that question was posed to you, because it is such a wide-reaching topic.
I think to me it's in terms of the audience, like who is it for? What is it meant? Who is it meant to teach? What do you want to bring to people? It's kind of, there's a perpetuating theme on museums being curated through the European gaze since the Cabinet of Curiosities, and where museums is an original model. It's just a place for them to show off things they've taken from different colonies. And in the way, saying whose museum now might kind of, in a way, to ask this question again in this modern time. What is this museum for? What is the gaze? What is the intended audience? Is it time to change this narrative?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
Oh, all right. Yeah, Don, just to sort of jump on that and to add on to that, I think that your point is really valid. Well, what sort of comes up to my mind is whose museum? Well, historically, it's the museum of the privileged. Right. I mean, it is not the museum of, historically, it's not the museum of what is, shown in there. The museum belongs to those who are the sort of conquerors, the people who take over, the people who, exert their power. And it's interesting that you bring up the idea of the museum, or sorry, the Cabinet of Curiosities, specifically because this is something that was really designed to reinforce this sort of colonial narrative. It was not a museum in the common and then in the modern sense of, sort of area where you go to learn. It was a museum that was really structured to show off the power of an empire. And what I find really interesting about the current exhibition, Recollecting Empire, is that it sort of turns that idea on its head. You see the same sort of decontextualization that you would see in a cabinet of curiosities, where you have many artifacts next to each other with very little description. But instead of sort of pointing out the might of an empire, it points out the problem with the format, where you see so many things next to each other, and it leads to confusion, and it leads to more questions being brought up about these things. But I think it's sort of a really nice breakdown and a really nice way to sort of shine a light on the fact that museums are traditionally museums for the privileged.
Yeah, I think you've both very eloquently said what I was going to say. So I'll only say in addition that question really suggests a direction of travel, perhaps a kind of subversive direction of travel, where the power hasn't quite yet been transferred, but there seems a kind of an inevitability, at least, that we're having these conversations. I guess whether or not there is going to be a transfer of power is the sort of thing that we're going to get into in later aspects of the discussion. But yeah, I think it's provocative for all the right reasons.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, isn't it, is that everybody picked up on that. The historic aspect of it, who has a museum historically been for, and what was the aim of a museum in its inception, versus what role can and should a museum play today. And part of that is going and doing the work in favour of decolonization, as we are sort of speaking about this evening. I think what struck me as an interesting follow-up question from what you have all said there is, how do you decolonize something that's inherently colonial in its character? Because the thing is, as Tom mentioned, as you all alluded to, museums were set up in a very colonial mindset. It was about showing off the things that people thought they should be proud to have collected. So yeah, is it possible to decolonize a colonial institution? Big question. I realize this.
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I think that this kind of kernel of hope is what sort of drives us to keep on reassessing what museums are today, and sort of forces us to make them better, and make them more meaningful and more, I guess, more equal spaces. Is it possible? Yes, to make them less imperial, less harmful. I think it's possible to make them less. I'm not sure if it's ever possible to achieve the goal perfectly. I mean, we see examples such as, let's say, I mean, the sort of most famous example, the Bible Museum and the Ark Museum in the United States, right? I mean, there have been repatriation efforts that have been run through the United States government that have, I mean, just taken theft there because they've been illegally looted and they've been illegally trafficked. And so we see efforts, at least on a state level, that can make it, I mean, less colonial, that can make it, X, Y, and Z. But I don't think that it's ever possible to fully reach that goal. In the same way, we see even the Wardlaw Museum in its wonderful, in its wonderful current exhibition, Recollecting Empire. The point is that, the museum still does have a lot of these objects, and a lot of them are still unaccounted for, and we still don't understand it, and that is sort of a larger issue. I think that another area that this brings us into is the idea that museums are in a lot of ways sort of temples to an ideology, that they are, inherently, given why they were created, they are inherently a reinforcing structure to colonial ideas. So yes, I believe that if you were to maybe take repatriation efforts and be in contact with communities from which objects are sourced. You can make them definitely less colonial, but I'm not sure that it can ever be perfect. I'm not sure that you can ever find a museum that is completely decolonized. Yeah.
To add on to that, I've been volunteering at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, where they kind of raised the idea of retribution, or to bring a form of transforming its origin as being a museum of showing off looted items into an institution of education, where they have the Center for Material Culture set up in the museum, where they will have basically a database of local and global heritage itself in the Cambridge nuclear bunker I think in Christ College, where they will grant access basically to any student who want to learn more about these items and to hold conversations in a way. So might be, if decolonizing museums are inherently impossible, there's still a way to have attempt to make the idea of this institution more flexible, instead of, because completely transforming museums from its origins, it's inherently impossible.
I think that building on these 2 points, I know that there are certain anxieties within higher education about using words like decolonization when we're not talking about quite literally tearing it all down, because otherwise, what are we doing? We're kind of evading the accountability that we ought to have by making that word decolonization a metaphor and using it to kind of represent a kind of sanitized version of what might otherwise be considered too offensive for modern sensibilities. So I think these are really, really difficult ideas to be wrestling with, and I wonder if there would be more takers for if instead of talking about decolonizing museums, we talked about kind of diversifying narratives around what museums are doing and the content of museums.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, isn't it? Because I think decolonization has become somewhat of a buzzword, right? It's something that all museums are saying that they're doing, but what does that actually mean? And like you say, Akira, it is the word itself troublesome in some ways for that reason. I guess it comes back to that idea of recollecting, doesn't it? And that idea of diversifying narratives and that sort of thing. I think, obviously, objects have been acquired in colonial context, but there are ways in which museums can and should be working to diversify narratives and diversify workforces and that sort of thing, to sort of have on the ground action, I think, is the main thing. Decolonization is very much a sort of it's a theory, right? In some ways it sort of feels a bit theoretical, but actually on the ground, what can museums, what can other organizations do to actually make a change? I think that's really important. And Dawn, you mentioned there a little bit about how people gain access to collections, for example, and how that can be an important part of it. I think that's it. Obviously, the topic of repatriation immediately came up there as a point of discussion, and yeah, I wonder whether it's worth focusing on that for a minute, and then the other sorts of the other sorts of actions museums and other institutions might actually concretely be able to take to make some progress in this kind of work.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of repatriation is, I mean, again, it's another one of these ideas I have heard spoken about a great deal when it comes to museum collections, and I should, my kind of get out here is if I get stuff wrong, I'm not professionally involved in this kind of work. So Dawn and Tom and Ailey, feel free to put me in my place on this. I have been paying close attention to these conversations though, and the narratives here around theft and around structures that are allowed to profit from previous theft in ways that wouldn't ever be allowed if we were to talk about them in terms of I don't know, the ideas of personal property. You know, of course, if someone stole something from your house, you wouldn't have to negotiate with the person who stole it to get it back. Yet these are conversations that we seem to have in very kind of almost in some respect in ways that are very tolerant around the ideas of discourse and what property means and that kind of thing, even when they're not necessarily aligned with the views people might hold on, for example, personal property. There's a lot of, perhaps a lot of nuance to these conversations, but that again is being used perhaps to evade responsibility. And I'm also in that response, I'm not saying everything needs to just be sent back from whence it came, because I know that that's associated with cost. There are issues of whether or not the groups, the peoples whose property that was originally want those artifacts, want those objects, those collections back in the first place. So there's a lot of nuance there, perhaps, but maybe I'm trying to be too kind of intellectual about it, and maybe there is just a straightforward no, just there's a right answer here. Give it all back and start again with something else.
I think, like you say, Akira, there's this kind of, I don't know, this kind of suggestion of permanence, right? This idea that things should and should always be held in perpetuity, which is something that I guess a museum sort of functions for in many ways. Tom, I think you were about to come in on that point, and I just steamrollered you, so I'm gonna shush now.
Sorry about that. I think my mic might have been having some issues. Yeah, so Akira, I don't think that you're intellectualizing this too much at all. I think you really raised some great points. I mean, one of the bigger issues right now is that museums have become very political spaces, which is kind of one of the issues that we're grappling with in this talk. And in the fact that they've become political spaces, they've become places through which a lot of countries choose to push their agenda. So when you go through a repatriation effort, these are, I mean, massive political events, and generally they go along with negotiations as to what can be kept and what should go. I mean, in terms of just the amount of paperwork that has to be gone through, these things are extremely difficult and arduous. And I think you raise a really good point. In terms of repatriation, one of the things that I kind of want to bring up is that they don't all have to look the same. And that's something that I actually find really quite interesting, is that, you know, you can repatriate an object and then receive it back on loan, but have it still within the care, theoretically, of its, you know, owning community. You often run into issues where yes, the community to return something to is not always clear, but that's a simple product of the fact that, you know, the world 50, 100, 2,000, 4,000 years ago doesn't have the same borders that it does today. And, you know, people migrate and identities change, and, religions come in and out and weave amongst each other. And so in a lot of cases, you know, finding a country to repatriate something to is not as simple as finding a cultural group to repatriate something to. And generally in cultural groups, hierarchies are not quite as clear as in countries. If you were to find, let's say, let's say Yazidi people living in the Near East and Middle East, you know, that you could find them, but pinning them down to exactly one country, or all people who identify as Kurdish, you could definitely find many groups of people, but it'd be difficult in many cases to establish, you know, any sort of, you know, figure to create negotiations with. So yes, these things can be done. However, to bring them to fruition in many cases takes a lot of time and effort, and it's not always a terribly clear route. One thing that I kind of want to bring up is sort of museums that sort of focus on the object without having the object. And a great example of this is, let's see, I wrote it down because it has a nice long name. I think it's the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, where many of the objects that they have in their collections are real, but there are also many objects that they have that are plaster copies or replicas. They have the law codes of Hammurabi, which are famously at the Louvre. They have all sorts of Sumerian tablets that are all, you know, resin or fiberglass or plaster replicas. And they're able to still be able to talk about these objects without engaging, for a lot of them, in the sort of colonialist aspect of, you know, for lack of a, you know, better way of sort of describing this, collecting them like Pokemon cards, right? I mean, there is sort of an idea of, you know, well, gotta find the actual one and have it. Whereas realistically, you know, a picture of it or, you know, a copy of it does just as well to really impress upon people the size of an object. What, you know, color is it? How much do you think that weighs? Things like that can really be conveyed through other means. And, you know, even going through a museum of replicas, you can still get a really good sense of an object. And you can really get a really, really wonderful sense of craftsmanship or culture, things like that. I think that's something really important to think about, that, you know, repatriation doesn't exactly mean losing something. It means, you know, it means putting it back into the sort of custodial care of its, you know, sort of original peoples, original cultures, depending on the object and situation.
I think, yeah, you make a fantastic point there, Tom. And the idea, I guess, that, you know, everything has to necessarily be considered on a case-by-case basis. This is never going to be the sort of issue that is resolved in a one-size-fits-all sort of way. Dawn, sorry, I'll pass on to you.
Yeah, Tom, I actually really like what you say about repatriation, and isn't about owning something. Think about as more of sharing the knowledge of this one thing. Because I'm an art history student, I'm going to bring out some art museum references. So I think in terms of repatriation, it's easier for art museums because it's just like usually paintings and framed paintings where, for example, the Van Gogh exhibition that went from Copenhagen to Norway to the UK, they don't have the physical like object. They have it in the form of 3D immersive experience. In a way, it engages more people to learn about the histories and the movement, or example, more about the history behind these paintings. And the one thing that comes up is the geopolitics of material culture itself. For example, for a totem or a scrap of film, its very own fabric may be derived from different countries. For example, films from American cinema from Kodak is actually using cows they slaughtered from India. And for these films to be in archives, they have this conversation of whether should they give it back to India. But the problem is there's so much interconnected in the very building of material culture that it's really hard to have a definitive saying on who should I return it to. So there are certainly different ways, like Tom said, to have plaster casts, to have replicas, just so to really be less fixated on the idea of who to return to, and it's whose fault.
And I think also, John, that definitely speaks to, you know, what purpose do museums serve? Who do museums serve? Who are the collections in museums for? And I mean, I think that what everybody's kind of alluding to is that doing the work in speaking to, you know, audiences, groups, whoever it might be, is part of the process, and finding out what a new form of museum may look like. You know, I think that's part of it, isn't it? Is how do we take that sort of first step in finding out who collections are for and who do they benefit, basically. I think, you know, as we've all mentioned, Recollecting Empire is very much, you know, a first step in a process. As an exhibition, it's very much the start of a process for us as a museums service in looking at these issues. But I wonder, you know, the thing for me that I think we're all sort of trying to work out off of the back of the exhibition itself is, how does that exhibition and how do the legacies of what we've sort of come uncovered in that exhibition transfer now into the museum space more permanently, basically? Because the thing is, at the moment, is that it sits in the temporary exhibition space, but maybe doesn't so much feel as though it's flowing throughout the space. We are doing a project with different community groups at the moment, which will hopefully take the exhibition and some of its ideas out into the space. But I wonder whether there are any suggestions from our wonderful and insightful panelists on how do you take learning from exhibitions like this forward, and make sure that you know the reason that we hold objects in our collections is for the benefit of everybody.
I wonder if I could jump in there. I think there's a couple of things. One is around the kind of curatorial decisions that have been made about how some of the exhibits are written about. That is interesting in that it's kind of original and also subversive, and some of those curatorial choices are really kind of exciting to see. They add a kind of a bit of yeah, I mean, it feels subversive to see text added to with what we might actually be thinking when we read that kind of thing. So there's that angle to things, and there's probably room for that to make its way across the museum. Whether or not that would be a popular choice with everyone is a different matter. The other thing that I think is really important and perhaps somewhat unique when we're talking about museums that are situated within the context of broader organizations whose purpose isn't necessarily just to serve the museum, is that museums can be a really effective way of signaling the intentions for the culture in that place. And I say that as someone who went to the Recollecting Empire exhibition and then immediately spoke to all of the people I'm working with on a day-to-day basis on the Race Equality Charter and said, look, go to that exhibition and you'll feel good about doing this work in this institution because you will recognize that there are other people who are on the same page as you. So there's that kind of it's almost sticking up a flag and saying, look, these are some of our goals here. This might not be present everywhere, but there are people here who care about these issues, and that's a really hopeful thing, I think.
I actually really like what you talked about, Kira, on the diversity of voices in museums. And I went to the Collecting Empire exhibit, and I really like how they did not just consult people within the museum, but they actually ask students or ask research postgrad students about what they think about this artifact. And the catalogues are written specifically to the object by different people, which is kind of a very fresh and new, because usually for people working in an ordinary museum, they usually have the curatorial assistant or researchers to write these catalogues. And the fact the Wartlaw Museum taking away or transforming the narrative by letting students from the actual background of these intended items to basically write their own version of the catalog is really powerful, and it's a very in a way, very inventive or revolutionary, I think.
I think that you two have hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that really it's, yeah. I think that one of the best ways to bring, projects like these forwards and to continue developing on them is to continue to incorporate more viewpoints, more, incorporate more people from whatever cultures these objects are sourced. I think that is genuinely one of the best ways to do it. And I think that this idea of sort of, as Akira sort of brought up, of subverting, a lot of messages, of sort of bringing up and highlighting, ideas that it makes you think of. I think it's really something quite useful. Yeah, it may not be for all contexts, but I think that in terms of one like the Recollecting Empire exhibit, it really does, sort of point out this idea of change and sort of the development of the museum as a whole. And I find this exhibit specifically interesting because it feels more like an exhibit on the university and on museums than it does an exhibit of artifacts. It feels like, in the same way as I sort of brought up before, that Cabinets of Curiosities were more about the empire than the object. This is more about the museum than the object, but it's turning the narrative on its head, as I pointed out before. And I think that continuing to try to reassess what narratives should we be talking about, what sort of ideas should be brought up by these collections, by these things, or I think that that's really the avenue forward through this. I think that's one of the best ways that we can utilize our history and utilize our current holdings in order to progress conversations and make meaningful change.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, like you say, Recollecting Empire is very much an exhibition that kind of makes the point that the process is the point, if that makes sense. It's not a here's what we have in our collection and here's the definitive narrative of that object. It's an analysis of how things have been done and how maybe things should be done in the future. I think one of the things that we have been really clear about with Recollecting Empire, and we've been quite transparent about, is the fact that we don't know everything, we will get things wrong, and we're very much sort of open to people telling us that, if that makes sense. I think that in itself is kind of an interesting position to take as a museum, because, you know, I seem to remember there was a survey done a couple of years ago about what the most trusted professions were in Britain, and museum curator was actually up there. And it speaks a little bit to the fact that people see narratives in museums as just fact. People just accept that what they read in a museum is the truth. It's there's no shades of grey there. It's just, you go to museums to learn. However, we all know that is not the case. That is not the case. Very much anything in a museum is coloured by the bias of the person who's written the label, or anything like that. So yeah, I think that's a really important point to think. We've had a question come in, and let me just read it to you all and see if anybody might like to take a stab at it. So the question is, what role do you think that museums can play in encouraging people to challenge the status quo and tackling systemic change, even within museums themselves? Thinking in particular of the inherited and historic laws which bar the large national museums, most obviously the British Museum, from repatriating objects. Does anybody want to take a go at that question? I can see lots of faces deep in thought.
I mean, museums have to be integral to that, don't they? I think, Ailey, coming back to your point around museum curators being perceived as trustworthy because they give you facts. I think that's sure. We know that that's not true, but the idea that museums are nonetheless important because they stimulate discussion and conversation, and they give you the opportunity to explore ideas. I think that's hugely valuable, and there's nothing to say that just because there are I don't know, vested interests in a museum keeping its collections, that you can't have those conversations within a museum. You can't have some of these exciting conversations that Tom and Dawn have had about how you deal creatively with rethinking what an artifact is. Those are the sorts of things that I imagine are going to be played out in museums. I'd be really surprised if any policies or legislation changes, those conversations haven't come, at least in part, from what the museums have done themselves to stimulate conversation and discussion.
Yeah, if I could add on to that. What's interesting about this question, right, is, you know, it's sort of asking, to a certain degree, can museums continue, you know, what their initial function was meant to be? They were meant to be places. I mean, it's the muse and museum. It is meant to be a place of inspiration. It's meant to be a place where you're sort of thrown back to think about, well, you know, what is the way forward? What can I do? What, you know, to be inspired. And it's interesting now that we have so many of these, you know, sort of, you said historical laws, which bar the large national museums from, you know, repatriating objects. It's interesting now that that's being brought into light, because it's specifically those laws are forcing us. I mean, the fact that the Parthenon marbles have not been, you know, repatriated, that has caused so many more discussions about repatriation and about, you know, what things do we actually find to be moral in an institution which represents our, you know, country. it has caused so many more discussions because of that. That has really stimulated, that has stirred the pot many times. As an example, I mean, there is not a single ancient history class at this university that at some point does not bring up the Parthenon marbles. It just doesn't happen because it is such a sort of nucleation point for these discussions. And it's not to say that they shouldn't be repatriated, because they definitely should. But the point is that, you know, to what extent can they play this role in the future? I think that it's specifically because these laws are still around that it is forced into the sort of position of playing this role. That it is forced into a position where we have to keep on reassessing, where we have to keep on thinking about, well, you know, as a group, where do our morals align, and how have we changed over time? And sort of going back and sort of being forced to think about this iterative process that is, you know, heritage management. Yeah.
I think it also sort of lends itself to the discussion about the changing sort of priorities of museums from their very inception to now. I think, you know, as we've said, museums sort of began as one thing, and they have in more recent years, in the last few decades, become more audience focused. And I think part of this, you know, the change that's coming from within museums is because museums have started listening to audiences and finding out what people want from them. I think that's you know, a really you know, a good thing to bear in mind when we have these conversations, and you know how they've changed so much over the last few years. So we're out of time. Our time together has come to an end. It's been a really fascinating conversation this evening. So I just want to say thank you again to Akira and Don and Tom for being here and having this conversation with us, and for everybody who was tuning in and submitting questions this evening. As you can imagine and can tell from this conversation, we've barely scratched the surface, but we hope that we've sort of given you some thoughts to take away this evening, and you know, feel inspired to do the good things. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next month when the discussion is whose culture. Fantastic. Thank you.